Welcome to today's show. My name is Michael Juberg, and I'm with the Global Compassion Coalition. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Nicola Petrocchi, an adjunct professor of psychology at John Cabot University in Rome. She's an accredited compassion-focused therapy trainer in Italy and Europe. Her research focuses on the physiological correlates of prosocial motivation and how compassion towards ourselves and others improves psychophysiological well-being. She's the author of several national and international peer-reviewed publications and book chapters. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nick.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here with you tonight.
I really appreciate you making the time to speak with us. It sounds like you're calling in from Rome.
Absolutely. It's 7 p.m. here, a little bit cold, but it's very happy to be here and talking about compassion.
Beautiful. I'd like to start off by saying I've recognized and followed your work for some time. I've been inspired as a compassion researcher by your work and meta-analyses. It's very important work. But before we even jump into any of that, I want to kind of understand, tell us about your personal journey that led you into this work.
What a question. I think everything should be traced back to my childhood, I would say. As a gender non-conforming person, I was probably struggling a lot in my small city I grew up in. And so I probably faced suffering very early on in my life. I had I would say normal family, but of course my identity was, I was struggling to fit in, and I had a lot of, problems in growing up. But at the same time, probably that kindled some kind of interest in, looking for ways to navigate. And I remember that I became very early on very much interested in self-development. And I remember I was looking for meditation very, very early on in my life, probably as a way to navigate difficult emotions and loneliness, etc. When I had to decide what kind of university I wanted to go to, I realized that psychology was probably the best. And then I moved to Rome from this small city, and then I studied psychology, and I wanted to become a psychotherapist. So that probably was my dream, because I remember that I was helped in my childhood by a lot of self-help books and people that I realized they had a strong impact on me. So I probably wanted to give it back to people in a way or another. So I wanted to have the same influence also in other people. I wanted to help. And so, yes, psychology. And then I realized that probably I wanted to continue and become a psychotherapist. And I became a CBT psychotherapist. So a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. So very much based on cognitions and, schemas. But, something was missing in my training as a CBT psychotherapist. That's when I met compassion. That's when I was, reviewing papers back then. It was like 2011. And I found that this compassion-focused therapy approach that appeared to me as, that's very interesting. Like, is it a science? Can I be researching on this? Can I do this with my clients? And that's when I met Paul Gilbert and I started to explore. And here I am. After that, I never abandoned the ship.
Wonderful. So it sounds like your personal journey has led you from your adolescence and childhood into your professional identity. You're doing a lot of CBT work, but it sounds like for you, something was missing. And from there, you found the piece of compassion, and specifically compassion-focused training. Break that down. What is compassion-focused training?
Yeah, so compassion-focused therapy is a modality, it's a psychotherapy modality that Professor Paul Gilbert created now, I think 30 years ago. I mean, he is a very prolific writer. He's based in UK, and he's an evolutionary psychologist and also originally a CBT therapist, so a cognitive behavioral therapist. And back then, I think around 1990, realized that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, was not strong enough, especially when you want to help people with shame and self-criticism. So you can do a lot of work with these clients, trying to change their minds and trying to change their ideas, their self-critical ideas. But usually CBT techniques are not very helpful. So imagine that you have someone very self-critical and you ask this person like, okay, but just tell me why you think you're so self-critical. Don't you see all the data saying that you're a good person? Don't you see that your friends love you? And in a way, you try to make them realize kind of reason around their being lovable or, not deserving of criticism. But the reality is that they get the idea and we get the idea, because I also am a very self-critical person. I mean, I knew that I could be more compassionate with myself, but I didn't really know how to do that. Something was missing in the felt sense of compassion. And that's when Paul Gilbert realized that if you want to help someone, especially clients with a lot of depression and self-criticism, if you want to help them feel this kind of attitude and becoming more compassionate with themselves, you need to kind of shift and use completely different ways and techniques. So you need to use a lot of visualizations, a lot of techniques that are based on, some of them on the Buddhist tradition, some others are more, recent, and they kind of come from several contemplative traditions. But so the idea is that you want to help them feel the sense of compassion and feel this intention to be compassionate and not just thinking about that. And so basically he created compassion-focused therapy. So basically what he suggested is that, you can keep on doing all the techniques you're using in psychotherapy, but if you don't make sure that the client has this inner motivational shift to compassion, if you don't make sure, for example, that the client changes the inner voice tone from a critical one to a compassionate one, basically you can use all the techniques you want, but then they will not really achieve, you will not really achieve any change, because you might be telling yourself, oh yes, I'm lovable, or oh yes, I deserve respect, but you say that with a critical intention. And so you realize that you need to help people be aware of their inner talk. And gradually he realized that it was very helpful for clients to be helped in change this inner attitude from a critical one to a compassionate one. And also he developed this compassionate mind training that is basically a flow of practices and exercises that you can do with the client so that they gradually build this compassionate self-attitude. And so it's like doing a training. So the beautiful idea of compassion-focused therapy is that compassion is not an insight. It's not that you understand, oh, I like compassion and I do it. No, it's like something you have to train. It's like a new language you need to learn. And so it's not enough that you understand but also you need to practice a new language, and this is what I liked of compassion-focused therapy. So basically I learned how to cultivate compassion first in myself, and then I also helped my clients gradually to be more and more compassionate. And then I also became very interested in research, because what I loved of this approach, Paul Gilbert, is that he always connected the physiology of our human brain and body to the mind of a human. So basically what he suggested is that compassion is also linked to our physiology and specifically to the parasympathetic system. And I was like mesmerized by this association. I was like, oh, really? So you can really measure? And you really, is it something that the body feels, and you can see that in the body? And yes. And so basically I realized that basically the parasympathetic system is kind of a marker of this attitude, not only of compassion, but also of compassionate intention. And so I realized that I wanted to do more research on that, and I went into my PhD. So I was already like 35 years old. So it was like, I was a little bit old by then. So I said, okay, but I want to do that. And so I started my exploration, and here I am.
No, that's beautiful. I enjoy the coursing of that. And there's a few questions that come up, but I like what we're arriving at with the relationship between compassion and parasympathetic activation. And for our listeners, there's kind of two systems, and there's sympathetic, which is kind of what excites our system, and parasympathetic, which calms us down. And so even right now, the state of the research, what do we know about the relationship between compassion and parasympathetic activation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's very fascinating as we were mentioning right before starting this podcast. Definitely the relationship is more complex than we think. So definitely it's not a linear relationship, meaning that if you experience more compassion, it's not immediately correlated to increased parasympathetic system. So let me tell you the way I understand it. So basically, compassion is, in a way, is a very complex response to human pain, suffering. Okay, and first of all, it depends on what kind of suffering you're facing, because there are several types of suffering, and of course, if you break your bone, it's probably very different than if you tell me that you just lost a parent. Of course, there are several types of suffering, and I think that the human beings have different ways of responding to different types of suffering, of course. And in a way, in my opinion, when we experience compassion, when it's because we are dealing with some kind of also of existential suffering in a sense. So it's when you use your mind to reflect on how difficult being a human being is. So compassion comes not with just an automatic response to suffering, but when you observe suffering from kind of a contemplative attitude, kind of realizing that none of us really has chosen to be here in this world. None of us has chosen the gender we have, the type of experiences we endured. And this kind of realizations, this kind of contemplations about the many things of our life that are unchosen, it kind of kindled in us a sense of desire to help, a sense of tenderness, a sense of warmth that, in my opinion, is very close to what compassion is. For example, if I look at myself with the view of look at all the suffering you've endured, and the long path you've walked, and all the difficulty you've been going through, can feel like kind of a tenderness toward myself. I have a desire to help this creature that I am in this moment. Basically, when you talk about compassion, definitely there are two parts to compassion. The first one is when you connect with the raw pain, with the suffering. So if you talk about compassion, it's because there is suffering somewhere, either in you or in other people. So imagine that I'm witnessing the suffering of an animal or the suffering someone else suffering. The very first response to that suffering is kind of an increase in my, I would say, the threat system. If you're suffering, I respond with a sense of like, I'm there, and a kind of an empathetic response. And usually when we empathize with suffering, it's not pleasant. So that part of compassion is not relaxing. If you're telling me about something very painful, I'm not going to have a relaxation in that very moment. I'm going to empathize with you, and my system will be triggered by that pain. And you want your system to be triggered by that, because otherwise there wouldn't be any compassion. Compassion is not a Xanax. It's not a benzodiazepine. It's not that you don't experience pain. The miracle of compassion is basically after you connect with the suffering and you witness the suffering. Because if you have the intention to help, as soon as you see the suffering, what happens after is kind of a desire that suffering is in a way alleviated. So first part of compassion is empathy and awareness of suffering. I'm sensitive to that suffering. And the second part is, may the suffering be alleviated in a way or another. May you feel at peace with the suffering. So there is a second part in compassion. There is a second component of compassion that is mostly about the wish, the intention for that suffering to be alleviated. And to me, this second component of compassion, and also the studies talk about this component, it's the part that makes your system shift into the parasympathetic response. Because if you're just like overwhelmed by the suffering you're witnessing, there's no compassion. You're just resonating with suffering. You kind of collapse, and maybe you escape because it's too much, or you go into some kind of passive response, or you go into some kind of let me fix this. So you want a hyper coping strategy where you see the suffering and you want that to disappear. You don't want that in front of you. So with compassion, you sit with that pain. You see the suffering, and instead of escaping and trying immediately to fix, you kind of allow the presence and only with the intention to alleviate that. So you are in front of the suffering and you say, maybe I don't know how to deal with that, but may you feel peace with the suffering. May the suffering disappear. So you create a kind of an intention, a wish, and a motivation to alleviate that suffering. And that motivation to help, it's kind of what shifts the system towards a parasympathetic response. So basically, in the compassionate response, you have these two components. The first that basically is a sympathetic response, and then a parasympathetic response as soon as you open up a little bit of your, intention towards the alleviation of that suffering. And let me tell you one final thing that I think is very crucial in compassion. You don't need to know what to do in compassion. Of course, it's important that if you act for the alleviation of that suffering, you want to know what you're doing, because if you don't want to cut open a heart of someone with a heart attack just because you are compassionate. Like, you want to be a doctor, you want to be wise in your response. But in my opinion, compassion comes a little bit before the action. Compassion is when you really feel in your body the desire to help, the intention for that suffering to, in a way or another, to be alleviated. So, for example, if I see children suffering in TV, maybe very, very far away from where I live, in that moment, I might not be able to go immediately there. Maybe, I don't know, in some very remote place in the world. But I feel in myself the desire for that suffering to disappear, the desire for that children to smile eventually and to be free from that suffering. And I can connect with this intention, with this desire. And I think this is what creates this parasympathetic response in compassion. So sorry, it was a long response, but I hope I clarified a little bit of the complex relationship between compassion and the parasympathetic system.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. And one of the papers that I looked at, you actually use mirrors within the experimental design to enhance compassion. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was very much connected to my early explorations in compassion, because when I was a child, I was in love with someone who was very famous in the United States, Louise Hay. I don't know if you knew her. She was my guru when I was like 12 and 13 years old. She created a lot of self-help audio programs. And of course, it was a very particular approach. It was my initiation to psychology in a way. She was not a psychologist. It was basically a very new age. Something that was very beautiful about this early encounter with compassion is a couple of things. First of all, she would say, you need to work with the relationship with yourself first. If you want to feel good in your life, you need to face yourself in a way or another with a compassionate attitude. And second of all, she would suggest that one way to face yourself is to use mirrors, because you say, how else? Sometimes we don't see ourselves. And the most direct ways to see yourself and really be very clear about how you feel in reality is to observe the mirror. Because the mirror, if you look at in your eyes, you can really sense a lot of resistances. You can really go there. And so I remember that I started exploring compassion at the mirror and say, okay, let me see if this is true. Because if she's correct, maybe if we use a mirror, maybe the self-compassion exercises, compassion-focused techniques can be improved because you use a tool that makes it even more direct, And so this is what I tried. Basically, I said, okay, let me try and see if really using a mirror can strengthen, the compassionate response towards yourself. Because the idea was, maybe if you look at yourself, if you look at your face, you can have a better understanding of your suffering. Because sometimes when I suffer, I don't really see my face. But if you suffer, I can see your facial expression. Maybe I can use my mirror neurons and I can have kind of a more direct connection with the facial expression of suffering. And maybe I can empathize more. I can become more compassionate. And this is what we found. Basically, together with Cristina Taviani and another colleague of mine, we created 3 experimental conditions. The idea was, okay, just create phrases that you would use with a friend of yours. that is very critical of himself or themselves. And then we ask people to either repeat those phrases in front of the mirror to themselves. So, okay, you know those phrases? Take this mirror and talk to yourself using these phrases for 5 minutes. Or in the second experimental group, we asked them to repeat those phrases without a mirror, just as a control group. And the third group was, okay, just look at the mirror without the phrases, because maybe the idea was, maybe people are just more compassionate with themselves just because they look at the mirror. But actually, as we expected, what we found is that if you repeated those phrases out loud, if you repeat compassion-focused phrases and self-compassionate phrases out loud, it worked. And also it was able to improve your heart rate variability, your parasympathetic system, really meaning that really the parasympathetic response was there. But if you repeat those phrases looking at yourself in the mirror, really with this intention, there was a stronger response. And so we were able to find that if you use mirror, really, you can have a stronger compassionate response when you do compassion focused exercises. And from the moment on, I've been using this exercise with my clients. I have a mirror in my office, and sometimes when things become very like cognitive and it seems like the therapy goes into a lot of talking, I say, okay, let's take a mirror and see what happens. And I show them that it's possible to do it. And so I start with myself and say, look at your eyes. And the instructions are usually, imagine that those eyes are the same eyes that you had when you was a child. And because in fact, the eyes don't really change. And so imagine that you can connect with that child. And what would you tell? If you could use that channel, what would you say? And it's very moving. It's very beautiful because it's also very difficult. A lot of people say, no, I don't want to do that. But it proved to be a very impactful exercise, and also physiologically impactful because the heart rate variability would be higher.
How fascinating. And what an interesting use of a mirror in clinical work. I think I'll definitely try to bring that into my work. But it almost begs the question of is that what mirror neurons are? Obviously, mirror neurons are what we do when feeling somebody else's inner expression. But you're almost using it in a literal sense, a mirror neuron to reflect oneself and to understand the suffering more intimately, where I think a lot of people look past their own suffering. Classically, people are more self-critical to themselves than they are to their friend, right? If someone's best friend is suffering, they're not saying, hey, you're such a loser. But when they themselves have a tough day, that language comes very naturally. So I like how a mirror neuron kind of upends that cycle. So very, very powerful. And one of the last things you mentioned, you spoke to heart rate variability. Can you tell us what that is and how that relates to compassion?
Yeah, so heart rate variability is a number, first of all, is a measure, an index of the heart. So I don't know, if you have an iPhone, if you have a smartwatch or something, you can measure your heart rate variability. So very briefly, heart rate variability is a measure of the balance between the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system branches over the heart. So basically, every organ of the body is connected to mostly every organ in the body. For sure, the heart is connected to the sympathetic branches and the parasympathetic branches. It's like you have a gas pedal, that it would be the sympathetic branch, and the brake, that would be the parasympathetic system. And so the heart is healthy if you can use both the gas pedal and the brake. Of course, like if you come in Rome in my car, you don't want me to use only the gas pedal. You want me to use also the brake. Or you don't want me to use only the brake. You want also me being able to use the gas pedal. So you want a little bit of flexibility here, right? So you want your system to be using the brake when it's needed and to be using the accelerator when it's, the gas pedal when it's needed. And so as a baseline, the heart is connected to it fires very fast. If you remove the parasympathetic system from your body, you have your heart, the heartbeat at around 120 beats per minute. And it is the natural beat of your heart. But of course, none of us in this moment has 120 beats per minute. We are probably around 60 beats per minute or 65, 70, which means that there is constantly the parasympathetic system slowing down your heart. So basically the flexibility in the heartbeat is this mixture between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic controlling your heart. Okay. And what happens is, of course, is that the more flexible this co-regulation is, the more variability in your heartbeat you have. So what happens is that if you measure heart rate variability, it means that you're really measuring the impact of your parasympathetic system on your heart, meaning that the higher the heart rate variability is, the higher you're able to use the brake when you need it. So the higher you're able to use your parasympathetic system to slow down your heart and your system. So heart rate variability means it's basically a measure of the distance between each single heartbeat. So people believe that you have one heartbeat very precisely every other second, but it is not reality. So we maybe have one heartbeat right now and the next one after 800 milliseconds, and then the following one after 900 milliseconds, and then the third, the next one after 600 milliseconds. Basically, this variability means that your parasympathetic system is actually activated. It's good enough. You have a good break and you use it when you need it. And it's very important in compassion because it's very hard to have a compassionate response when you don't have a break. Because every suffering that we witness triggers in us some kind of stress response. And if you are overwhelmed with the sympathetic response, you are not able to help anyone. So if I see you suffering, I want to have a first sympathetic response because it means that I am connected with your suffering, but also I want to have my parasympathetic brake that slows me down to the point that I'm able to help. Because if I panic, I can help anyone and, right? So this is very true also with studies with children where they found that when children have a baseline higher parasympathetic tone, they're also those children that are more willing to help. Probably because when they witness the suffering of another children, they are not dysregulated and they are able to control themselves and they're able to help. So there is a wonderful connection between helping, willingness to help, and emotional regulation, to the point that if you are enough emotionally regulated, you are also the person that is more willing to help because basically you feel, okay, I can handle that. But also, if you're willing to help, that also triggers more emotional regulation. So that's why compassion is such a strong tool for emotional regulation. Because if you trigger someone, if you help people to have a compassionate motivation, also the emotions are more regulated. Because in this mindset, in the helping mindset, in the compassion mindset, your emotions are more regulated. And so there is this bidirectional connection between emotional regulation and compassion.
I love the work that you're doing. That's such an interesting measure to bring into the study of compassion, and one that for people who are at home, if they have certain types of fitness watches, they can actually measure and watch their own heart rate variability as an index of general health, but also maybe how it relates to their emotional states. And so it's great to see that work really being developed, and I'm very excited to see where that goes. My final question for you, Nikki, is it looks like a lot of your work recently has been looking at how compassion-focused approaches can be adapted for underrepresented and marginalized communities. Why is that important? And can you give us some examples of what those adaptations might look like?
And also you told me that you're also working, right, with, underrepresented populations. And I think that this is very important because originally all literature or scientific literature is developed on a specific type of sample. Usually university students, right? Sometimes, the all research is a little bit biased. But apart from this observation, I think it's quite important to be able to say that compassion works for everyone, right? Especially those who are more marginalized and more, they're less privileged. And one group of people, of course, that is going through difficulties, especially in Italy, and not only are, of course, queer people, for example, LGBT plus population, transgender population, because we, as you probably know, and we are definitely not the only sample in the community that experiences this type of condition. For example, also race and other type of course, diversities, they bring about this kind of problems for us. But the problem is that we are exposed to a lot of systematic stress. When you go out and you are an LGBT plus person, especially if you are evidently so, even if you don't realize that there is kind of a systemic stress that you experience. What we call is a minority stress. And of course, it's the stress linked to the fact that even if maybe you don't realize it very often, but people either look at you or you expect that people react to your diversity with some kind of whatever bullying attitude, and that brings your threat system, that brings your sympathetic system kind of chronically activated. And even if you're not aware, we now have studies showing that minority people, people belonging to minorities, they kind of present this chronic stress response that in the long run, it brings definitely increased risk of, for example, cardiovascular disease. And if on top of that, you also have a lot of shame connected to the fact that you have something that somebody could define a not normal sexuality, normal identity, etc., you basically add even more difficulties to this condition because you also feel the shame, you feel the isolation. And a lot of these responses, sometimes they are internalized. And so a lot of us become very much self-critical. They tend to become more self-bullying. And this is very much true I work with a lot, for example, of gay individuals, like cis male individuals that, for example, they criticize themselves a lot simply because they're not muscular, they're not fitting with the ideal of the, typical gay male, that again is becoming another standard that is kind of bullying who you are in a sense. So I think that with individuals like us, transgender people or LGBT plus individuals and other marginalized individuals, it's very important to have them realize the inner bullying that sometimes happens. And we can't change society immediately, but we can change our inner society, I would say. We can make it more compassionate. And so what I do is that also when doing some research on that is that we are helping our population, this population, to become more aware of this automatic shame response and self-critical response, and more aware and able to shift into a compassionate response, both for ourselves and for others. In fact, we are talking a lot about queer compassion focused therapy, queer compassion and mind training, or as I like to say, compassion focused queerness, because we talk a lot about pride, right? For example, in my community, we talk a lot about we need to be proud of who we are. And that's definitely true. But also we need to be compassionate, because sometimes when you're only proud, you tend to forget the suffering that we endure and other people endure. So I would say that we have to use pride, but also compassion when we deal with our suffering.
Nikki, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so inspired by your work. It's such a privilege to be able to talk with you. Your work is intersecting so many different disciplines, and I think that shows kind of the future of compassion research, where it does involve the neurophysiological systems. It does involve marginalized communities. All of it's so integrated, and it sounds like you and your colleagues are really pushing that work. So I just want to really give you a shout out and appreciation for the work you do. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you giving us so much time to talk and learn about your path and your work.
Thank you, Michael. It was a long path. It is a long path, and there are many venues and many paths we can explore. And I also hope we can have this conversation again in the future, because we need to explore more and more ways to convince people that compassion is the way, because sometimes our society, we live in a world that wants us to go in a complete opposite direction. I work with compassion focused therapy, and then the world is doing a competition focused therapy instead. So we are always in a kind of rank and competitions. We need to work hard to make people realize that compassion is really the way. And if we keep on competing with each other, there's not going to be a lot of space for life and survival in this planet. So I think we need to really join this bigger community. So thank you for inviting me in the Global Compassion Coalition, that such a wonderful community.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Nikki.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This episode was produced by the Global Compassion Coalition and hosted by Michael Jubert. Recorded in 2025. Original music by Guy James. Find our links in the show notes. Thanks for listening.